from the Washington, D.C. area. It's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight, on the eve of our 4th of July celebrations, we are bringing a special guest to you, Pat Wirth, who is the Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. And what we're going to be talking about tonight, is the history of the suffragist movement, which is very important to this ongoing experiment in democracy that was started in 1776. So thank you so much, Pat, for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Catherine.
So we did start an experiment in 1776, and women were here. We were here.
That's exactly right. And you may know that when John Adams was en route to Philadelphia to help draft the Declaration of Independence, Abigail, who wrote to him frequently, sent him a letter, and I don't have the exact wording with me, but basically she said to him, remember the ladies,
yes,
because she wanted to see some kind of equality for women in the Declaration of Independence, and of course, as we know, that didn't happen.
That didn't happen. You know, you get a sense of that in the musical Hamilton as well, in one of the musical numbers where Angelica says when she meets Thomas Jefferson, she's going to compel him to put women in the next version, right? And so women have been here, we have been advisors, we have been married to the men who had the voice, but it was a long slog in our history from Seneca Falls all the way to women getting the vote in 1920.
Yeah, I mean, slog is a good word.
Yeah, it is, because I'm sure it felt like a boulder up a hill pretty much every decade that women were doing it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'd like to do today on your program, with your permission,
Absolutely,
is to talk a little bit about the history of the suffragist movement, because what we're trying to do at Turning Point is to raise funds to build a memorial to commemorate the 5 million women who fought for 72 years to get us the vote. And that's a big surprise to a lot of people to learn that the suffrage movement actually lasted that long. Because if you look at today's, our children's history textbooks, both in elementary school and in high school, and their social studies books, and you look at the progressive era, which was 1890 to 1920, you will find 1, possibly 2 paragraphs about the suffrage movement, and the only person that they'll mention is Susan B. Anthony. Now, she was a dynamic woman who devoted her entire life to gaining suffrage for American women, and so for her to be focused on was an appropriate thing to do. But she was one of 4,999,999 women that everybody discounts.
You know, and that's so true of so many movements, and I would say of the civil rights movement or any important movement. There was decades of work by people who are no longer in our collective memory, and then at the turning point of those movements, there were people who were very visible, and they become the standard bearer for the work of so many people who came before.
Exactly. Sometimes when I do my presentations, I ask the audience whether they saw the movie Hidden Figures. I don't know if you saw
Yes,
Hidden
I did.
Figures.
I love that movie.
The movie was a great movie, and I saw it myself, and I thought it was just a tremendous movie. But the way it made me feel at the end of the movie was, why did I never hear of these amazing 3 women who worked for NASA?
Critical to that program.
Critical to our space program, and we've never heard of them. And that's exactly the same thing that's happened with the suffragists. One of our historians, Edith Mayo, who's nationally renowned, and she works with us on a regular, continuing, almost daily basis, will say that the suffrage movement is the best kept secret in American history, and she'll go on to say, and the reason for that is because the men who wrote the history books didn't think it was important, and they left it out.
You know, it's so interesting you say that, because there's a whole chapter in the book Originals written by Wharton business professor Adam Grant, and it's called The Narcissism of Small Things, and the entire chapter is about the history of the suffragist movement in this country. And it's fascinating. And there's so many moving parts to it that even I was stunned at what I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've been with the organization for a little over 2 years in my position. And the reason that I got involved, I am a certified professional nonprofit specialist, and I love working with nonprofits. It's what my true purpose and joy in life is. But I really got reeled into this particular organization because the more I found out about what I didn't know, it really made me angry because I'm an avid reader. I love history. I love America. And I've worked very hard in my career, and most of my work has always been in male-dominated industries. And when I found out some of the information about what these women had done and gone through, I was just absolutely amazed that I'd never heard of it.
You know, it's interesting, too. I've recently read this book called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. And she talks about the many movements that have taken place where once we achieve something, we forgot how we got there. And she said if we are going to build monuments, we should be building monuments to the journey of how we got to the outcome. And I thought, what an exceptional idea that we should build monuments to how we got there. And to me, that's exactly what the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is trying to do.
That's correct. And if I may, I'd like to read to you something that author and political pundit Eleanor Clift had to say about the suffragists. She said, "They engineered the greatest expansion of democracy on a single day that the world had ever seen, and yet suffrage faded from public memory almost as soon as it happened. The leaders built no monuments to themselves, and too many of their names have been lost to history." Exactly what you're saying. And that is what we're trying to change. We want people to know this history. Nowadays, lots of times we'll see, why aren't there more women in the C-suites? Why aren't there more women who are running for political office? Why aren't there more women in STEM? Well, I have a theory, and my theory is that these women were not written into history, and girls didn't have role models. Girls have not had role models for decades. I mean, some of the things that the women accomplished, the suffragists have accomplished, is just amazing. And as a matter of fact, I've now coined a new name for these suffragists, and I am now calling the suffragists America's original Wonder Women.
Oh, yes, I love that. I love that. That is so true.
Yes.
But they have not been given their due.
No, they have not. And they were just tremendous, amazing women. And I'd like to introduce you to some of them.
I would love for you to introduce us to some of them.
Okay, well, here we go. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met in 1840 in England, and they were at an anti-suffragist conference. They had traveled all the way across the ocean to go to this conference, and Lucretia Mott was actually a delegate. And when they got there, they said, "Oh, well, you're women, you can't talk." And they literally hid them behind curtains, and they were unable to participate in the conference that they had traveled all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to participate in. And they never quite got over that.
I wouldn't have gotten over
that.
No,
they never quite got over that. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker, and she was an abolitionist. She was also a Quaker minister. Elizabeth Cady Stanton her father was a judge, and she actually was allowed to go through what we would consider elementary and high school. She was not allowed to go to college because women were not going to college. There weren't colleges that accepted women in that time frame. So what happened was, a few years later, these women decided that it was time to have a women's rights convention, and the two of them put their heads together, and they sponsored the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848, July of 1848. There were about 300 participants, both men and women, who were there. It was a two-day conference. Frederick Douglass was one of the attendees at the conference, so it was integrated. And at the end of the conference, the result was a declaration of, I want to say Declaration of Independence. It was based on the Declaration of Independence. But it set forth all of the elements that women wanted. They talked about taxation without representation. There were some women who were property owners because they inherited from their father, or perhaps their husband had died, but they were taxed, but they had no say-so because they couldn't vote. If they worked, their husband got their pay. And if you were married, you were civilly dead. You had no rights, and so forth and so on. And Frederick Douglass said, Declaration of Sentiments. And Frederick Douglass said, well, one of the tenets of this should be that women get the vote. Now, that was pretty controversial back in that time. That they hadn't been talking about that. They'd been talking about a lot of other things. But he said, you really need to add that, and they did. They added that to their Declaration of Sentiments. So that's where they kind of drew the line in the sand and said, okay, now we really need to talk about this, and let's move forward.
And that's the extraordinary thing, is to think that there was a time when the very idea that women should be allowed to vote was shocking, extraordinary, and controversial. Mm-hmm. People need to remember, there was a journey.
There was quite a journey. So these are the women that were there. And then in 1851, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met, and they forged a lifelong relationship. I think Elizabeth died first, but they forged a lifelong relationship. And one of the things that they did is they started varying suffrage organizations, associations. And I say that because there were a number of different ones that came about. And they didn't always get along, and they didn't always agree on how they should proceed to gain suffrage. But nonetheless, these two women got together and became lifelong friends. Susan B. Anthony was just a tremendous woman. I mean, she just fought so hard for suffrage for women. And in one of the presidential elections in 1872, she just marched into the voting booth and she voted, and they dragged her out and they beat her on the streets. She was arraigned. She was charged with whatever the charge of the day was. She had to go to court. She was found guilty. But the judge figured she'd suffered enough and just kind of let the whole thing go. But she just wanted to exercise her rights, and didn't get to do that.
And and I think that one of the reasons we need to build this memorial is we should never forget who these women were. We should never forget what they were willing to do, so that we can have something that many of us, A, take for granted, and B, don't even exercise, which is a whole topic for a different show.
Yes, it is.
But the fact of the matter is, we must not forget the sacrifices that were made and the courage that was shown by these women.
Exactly.
So one of the things that I want to do, we're going to take a break, but one of the things that I want to do before we take that break is to let people know that when we come back, there's going to be more of this aspect of finding out who these women were, because most of the issues that we have today is that we do not know our own history. And before we can wave the flag and exercise and value those rights, we need to understand where they came from. So please join us after the break.
Some dreams are universal, dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
from the Washington, D.C. area. It's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I am so excited to have as our guest tonight Pat Wirth, who is the Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. In this segment, we are doing a little bit of history and education about why it is we're trying to build this memorial and what we hope to gain by elevating the story of these patriots, these women who gave so much so that the rest of us enjoy the right to vote here in 2017.
Exactly. So the next suffragist I'd like to introduce our viewers to is Mary Church Terrell. She was a founding member of the NAACP in 1909. She was an educator, she was a principal, and I'm pointing out that she's an African American because African American women were involved in the suffrage movement from the beginning. Many women who were advocating for social change and social justice during this period of time and the last 50 years of the 19th century were involved in numerous overlapping organizations fighting for justice. And many of them were abolitionists, many of them were prohibitionists. One of the reasons they were prohibitionists, by the way, was because if your husband went out and got quite inebriated and came home and decided to beat the living daylights out of you, that was perfectly okay because he could do that because you were his property.
That's one of the things that was highlighted in the book, the originals, is exactly that, the coalition with the Temperance League and getting, and this is when we talk about a liberal progressive viewpoint and conservative viewpoints, one of the things that this chapter in this book really talks about was how those alliances had to be forged in both camps and that the Temperance League became very important in moving forward the suffragist movement.
Yeah, they were absolutely involved. Mary Church Terrell was one of the first African American women to get a college degree. She went to Oberlin College, so that was a plus in her camp. The next suffragist I'd like to introduce everybody to is Carrie Chapman Catt. She was part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. We refer to that as NAWSA. She was active in it, then her husband took ill, and she got reactive in it at a later time. And her organization primarily from the beginning focused on states getting voting rights. And a lot of people don't realize that over time there were a number of states and territories in the West that gained the right for women to vote before the 19th Amendment was passed. Now, what did that mean? Did that mean that they could vote for everything? Not necessarily. It was different in every state. Maybe in one state you could vote for the school board, and that was it. Maybe in another one you could vote for the President of the United States, and that was it. Sometimes it was full voting rights, but it was different in each state on how that was. But that was one of the things that organization initially focused on, was state voting rights. The next person that I would like to introduce you to is Alice Paul. She's the reason I'm sitting here. Why? Because Alice Paul was a Quaker from New Jersey, and I'm a half Italian from New Jersey. And when I found out about Alice Paul and I learned everything that she had accomplished, and I had never heard of her, my Italian ire got a little hot there. It's like, how could I have not heard of what this woman did? She was a Quaker. Her family was well-to-do. Her father was a banker, had a farm. She was very well educated, and I will tell you, at the time of her death, she probably had 10 different college degrees in all kinds of different things.
Wow.
And when she was finishing her education, as did many affluent American girls, they went to Europe, and she did. And when she was in Europe, she was in Germany to begin with, then she was in England, and she became involved with the Pankhurst family. And she became very involved with the suffragette movement in England. And their methods were considered very militant. They thought nothing of throwing a bomb in a mailbox and blowing it up. They set fires to things. They broke windows. They did, all kinds of protests. And Alice was very involved. She met another American that was there, Lucy Burns, and they eventually came to the United States and worked together. We'll talk a little bit about Lucy in a little bit. But she really learned a whole different body of how things were being done in England to move forward in getting suffrage for the English counterparts as well.
So I'm going to pause here just to highlight this, the fact that suffrage is getting the right to vote. Suffragettes in England took a very militant stance toward that. And so the suffragettes, and there was a movie called Suffragette.
Correct.
In the United States, Americans, we called it suffragists. This is the suffragist movement.
Yes.
And so that's a distinction that often people get confused.
And the difference, deliberate difference is, in the United States, the suffragists did not promote or advocate anything that they were doing in a militant
or
way,
violent way.
Violent way.
Violent
is the word that I'm looking for. Thank you. Where they did, and because Alice Paul was a Quaker, so she didn't believe in it, but and that was the big difference. And so the English are the suffragettes, and the Americans are the suffragists. So you've got that right.
We just need to make sure everybody's getting their terminology correct.
That is correct. I'd like to introduce you to the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Now, who are these wonderful women?
They're amazing.
They are amazing. In 1913, Alice Paul decided to foster and host the first civil rights movement in Washington, D.C. There had been other suffragist parades in Boston and New York, but there had not been one in Washington, D.C. And there were the sorority, the Alpha Kappa Alphas, and that's what's on this. It says on their picture, the Alpha Kappa Alphas. There were some women that belonged to that sorority, and they wanted to march, and the Alphas said, well, we're sorry, but our rules don't allow you to do that. So there were 22 very brave young women who broke away from the sorority, and they started the Delta Sigma Thetas, and their very first act was to march in that parade in 1913. Now, it was not without controversy, because there were a lot of Southern suffragists who were not in favor of having African Americans in the parade. There was a woman by the name of Inez Mulholland Beausovan who led the parade, and many of us have seen her picture on a white horse leading that parade. And she was a member of the NAACP, as was her father, and she said, they don't march, I don't march. And it was like a no-brainer. They wanted suffrage for all women, and that's the way it was going to be. So that was the first act that these women did. And I'm very proud to say that they're one of our national partners. So we're very, very, so here's a picture of the parade. Pretty amazing. There were 9,000 women and men from all over the world, because at that time there were some countries that had gained suffrage. There were some states that had gained suffrage, but there were people from every state that came, and they were dressed to the nines. They were wearing, all kinds of costumes. I can't even imagine what the cost was for them to get all duty-dooed up to do this. But the strategy of this meeting, this parade, was that they held this the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So Woodrow Wilson comes into Union Station on the train, and there's nobody there to welcome him. He goes, where is everybody? He was not a happy camper. I mean, day one, even before day one, he was president. He wasn't real happy with the suffragists because there wasn't anybody to greet him at Union Station. And they said, well, they're all down on Pennsylvania Avenue. There were 500,000 men, mostly men, that had come for the inauguration that were watching the parade. And it got out of hand because they had been drinking, and it turned very violent. The women that were marching were accosted. They had clothes ripped off. They had their banners ripped apart. And the DC police wouldn't do anything about it. And the Secretary of War had to call in the cavalry from Fort Myer to break it up.
So this is very interesting how things echoes through the century, because in our most recent inauguration, not the day before, the day after, what you saw was the same sort of persistence, the same sort of focus, the same sort of coming together of women who wanted to come and make a stand in Washington, D.C. to send a message.
Exactly.
But how many people who were at that Women's March know about this 1913 march prior to Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. I would say less than 5%.
Yeah, probably. I mean, once again, it's because it's never been in mainstream history. So after this parade, this was in 1913. The women kept trying to get traction. There were a few more states that were coming online. But Alice Paul, from day one, always believed that we needed to have an amendment to our Constitution, because she said the South will never vote for this. So if women in the South are ever going to get the vote, it's got to be through a national amendment, and she was right. So they were looking at all different ways to try to make this happen. And they decided that Woodrow Wilson was a Republican. They were all Republicans that were in office at that time, primarily Republicans in office. And so they decided that since it was the Republican Party that was stonewalling in Congress, that they needed to get people out into the grassroots and say, we need to vote for a Democratic president and other people and get them the heck out of here because we want the vote and these people aren't doing it. So does that sound familiar?
Well, it does. However, I will point out that Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat.
Oh, I meant to say, yeah, you're right.
He was a Democrat. But that was when the Democratic Party was very different.
And you're absolutely right.
And very conservative.
You know, I made that mistake before, and I don't know why I do that, but yes, he was.
Because you're conflating in your mind the Republican Party of today with what was happening in the Democratic Party in 1913.
Right. Yes.
But the point that you make, the people don't remember that about Woodrow Wilson. They remember League of Nations. They remember a lot of things, but they don't remember his adamant refusal to even consider women's suffrage.
Right.
He was an opponent.
Yeah, he was an opponent. And people don't realize that one of the first things he did when he was president was to segregate the federal government.
Oh yeah, racist too. I mean, there's actually been more about that, his racist past, than what he did with women.
So Inez, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the ones that got on a train, and she headed out west, and she was doing the whistle stops, suggesting that people should vote for Republicans. So that they could get a new legislation passed that would allow women the vote with the national amendment. And when she was in California, she collapsed and died about a month later of pernicious anemia. And this was in November of 1916.
Wow.
Somehow, some way, and I don't know that, I'm not a historian, which is probably why I made that other mistake. They were able to have her wake at the U.S. Capitol. First time a woman had ever been held in state there. And it was attended by massive amounts of people. And 300 women from the National Women's Party got a meeting with President Wilson.
And when we come back from our break, I want to hear more about the meeting with President Wilson. So please join us after this break.
There's more than just books at the library.
There's more than just books at the library.
Excuse me.
There's more than just books at the library.
Il y a plus que de livres à la bibliothèque.
Hello. You have a lot of great books here today. You know there's more than just books at the library.
I know.
There's more than just books at the library.
I don't want to be hooked to a machine.
I want all the medical treatment available to me.
I wouldn't want my family to have to make this decision.
My doctor knows what's best for me.
An advance directive is your life on your terms. Talk with your family. Decide what's right for you. Then put it in writing.
Documenting my wishes today means my family won't have to make heart-wrenching decisions later.
To learn more, visit www.putitinwriting.org.
1,200 American youth run away from their homes every day. The National Runaway Switchboard is here to help. 1-800-RUNAWAY. If you are a runaway, thinking about running away from home, or a parent or guardian concerned about issues facing your child, Call us 24 hours a day. 1-800-RUNAWAY. In times of crisis, hope is just a phone call away. 1-800.
Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight I'm so excited to have Pat Wirth here with us from the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. Thank you, Pat. I interrupted your story about the meeting at the Capitol. I want to hear more about what happened.
Well, after they had the service for Inez, 300 women met with President Wilson in early January, a couple of weeks later, and they said, we've had somebody that's actually died now trying to get the vote. Can't you do something? And he basically said that his feeling was that they really needed to look state by state, that there wasn't anything he could do.
States' rights. How often do we hear that even today?
So, immediately, Alice Paul called up her army of women, and they started picketing the White House. First time ever that this had been done. The first civil rights type of this thing that was ever done. And a lot of people don't realize that both Martin Luther King and Gandhi took from the suffragists how to do peaceful protestation from these women. And they began protesting in front of the White House in January of 1917. They had banners that had all kinds of information on it about Wilson wanting to get into World War I. And he was going to the American public saying, we've got to go to Germany and we've got to fight the Kaiser and we've got to help those Germans have democracy. And the women were saying, hello, what about us? We'd like to have a little democracy here ourselves. And so they would take his speeches and literally put them on banners and walk up and down in front of the White House. He was not amused, needless to say. So in June, literally 100 years ago this month, women started being arrested on trumped-up charges of obstructing traffic. And they were sent to the courts, they were found guilty, and they were told to pay a fine, and the women said, we are not paying a fine because we didn't do anything to break the law. So those first couple of times that happened, they were released. However, the women didn't give up. I mean, they continued picketing, and so the sentences began being greater, and they started incarcerating the women. And there were some that were kept in the D.C. prison in D.C. proper, and then there were some that were put on a train and sent out to the Occaquan workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. And Lucy Burns is one of the women that had co-founded the National Women's Party along with Alice Paul. She was there. Along with other women from ages 19 to 73. They were kept in inhumane conditions. They were given straw mats on the floor. They were vermin infested. They were given blankets that were soaked in urine and vomit. They were given food that was infested with maggots. It was pretty horrific what they were put through, all for picketing the White House for the right to vote. In November of 1917, on November 14th in 1917, the women were protesting within the jail that that they were political prisoners and they wanted to be treated that way. And in comes the warden, and he gave the guards the go-ahead to literally beat the crap out of all of the women who were there. There was one woman who was in her 70s. It was picked up, slammed down. She was rendered unconscious. Her cellmate thought she was dead. She suffered a heart attack. I mean, it was just absolutely horrible.
Isn't that referred to as the Night of Terror?
That's
and the documentary Iron-Jawed Angels.
Correct.
I believe, and which is available online. If people want to see Iron-Jawed Angels, you can see it for free. It's online, but it really specifically talks about that night.
Yes, it does. And so the other thing that happened was these women would go on hunger strikes. And this is a kind of a look at what happened to these women on hunger strikes. They were force-fed, and they said this was to keep them from dying because they didn't want any more martyrs, when in fact this type of force feeding is considered torture today.
Right.
And sometimes these women underwent this 3 times a day. Alice Paul was incarcerated in the DC prison. She went on a hunger strike for 22 days, and she underwent this force feeding for 22 days, 3 times a day. I mean, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine. Well, when word leaked out about this, the women were all sent to the DC prison, and then within a very short matter of days, they were all released. They were in terrible condition because they had just been kept in the most horrible of circumstances. And they had appealed the rulings against them, against their arrests, convictions, and imprisonment. And the Court of Appeals found that all of those charges had been illegal against all of them. Some of them were in jail for 7 months.
You know, and this is
amazing.
And this is why, again, why we need a memorial. We need a memorial to the journey and the sacrifices made.
Exactly.
Women know they got the vote. We know we got the vote.
Right.
We can celebrate in 2020. Oh, look, we got the vote. But what we're not building monuments to is the women and the sacrifices and what they went through.
Exactly. So the U.S. Congress literally. Wilson, within days, went to Congress and said, I think that we really ought to do something. And the House of Representatives passed the amendment, but it failed in the Senate. And, and then they would bring it up again, and it would fail in the Senate and fail in the Senate and fail in the Senate, until finally, in May of 1919, the House passed it and then the Senate passed it. So that was the good news. But then they had to ratify it, and they needed 36 states to do that. And they were going all over the country trying to make that happen. They had 35 states, and it got down to Tennessee. And this is a heck of a story.
It is a great story. This is a heck of a story. The perfect 36 in Tennessee.
I mean, everybody was there. The National Association of Women, NASA, was there, and also people need to realize there were a lot of women who were not in favor. They were anti-suffragists. Right. They did not want suffrage.
Right.
They were head of their households. They said, my husband can do my voting. I don't need to vote. So everybody ascended into Tennessee. The state representatives, some of them left the state, so they didn't even have a quorum to vote to begin with, because they thought they did not want to be the state that pushed this over the top. But they eventually got together. And when they had the day that they were going to vote, they all marched in. And if you were in favor of the amendment, you wore a yellow rose. And if you were opposed to the amendment, you wore a red rose. And the suffragists knew right away they did not have the vote.
Right.
They didn't have the vote. And so they went down the line, and everybody voted one by one by one, and they got to my hero, Harry Byrne. Harry Byrne had received a letter from his mom that morning that said, "Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against, they were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification, your mother." Well, he took off his red rose, he put it down, and he voted yes. So one vote is what got women the vote in this country, one vote. So people need to understand that their votes count, and that one vote can make the difference.
And this is the other point, and I'm going to continue to make it, is that how many people knew the name of the one man who made the difference, Harry Byrne, or the fact that it was a letter from his mother. I will mention that he was all of 23 years old.
Yeah, he was just a kid. He was really cute, too, by the way. And so this is Alice Paul toasting with grape juice, because she was a Quaker and she didn't drink, on ratification. So now, if we may, I'd like to get into a little bit about the Suffragist Memorial itself and talk a little bit about how we all got started. 10 years ago, what was then called the Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority went to the League of Women Voters and said, and we have a park called Occaquan Regional Park, and it's right down the hill from where the women were held during the suffrage movement at the Occaquan Workhouse. And what do you all think about doing a memorial to commemorate these women who were incarcerated here? And they said, we think it's a great idea, and a committee was formed. And as these women did more and more and more research, just like myself, who didn't know a whole lot about it, they determined that indeed it made sense for this to be not just a visual symbol of what had transpired over 72 years and 5 million women, but also an educational tool to be able to tell the whole story. And our design for this memorial does just that. We have 19 stations, information statements that go through and tell the whole story in vignettes. And it's pretty amazing. Our mission is to educate, empower, and inspire present and future generations to remain vigilant in the quest for equal rights. So we're all about not just the suffrage movement, but moving forward. You know, there are things that we have in mind, and I'll tell you about that in just a second, Catherine. But the first thing, number one, is to accomplish our mission, is to build this memorial. And we've got some renderings here that we can put these up. This is a top-down look at the memorial. If you take a look at the rectangle on the right, in case you're wondering what that is, we're hoping that we will actually have a train, a passenger train from the era, because there were so many suffragists that went all over the country advocating for suffrage on the trains, because that was their mode of transportation.
That makes sense.
I have to tell you, these women were absolutely amazing. Without the technology that we have for communication and transportation, what they were able to accomplish is just miraculous. I mean, it's just miraculous what they were able to do. It never ceases to amaze me. This next rendering is an overview of the memorial, and the front is intended to replicate the White House gates where they were picketing. And there are other elements in there. All of the elements within the design all have to do with the suffrage movement. Every single thing has a reason and a rationale that ties to the suffrage movement and things that were done.
And I believe, too, that the architect is local.
Yes, Robert Beach, and he is also a member of the Fairfax County History Commission. He's a remarkable man, and I would like to say that he and his organization donated his time and effort to our association.
Well, I happen to know Robert Beach, and he's also a Rotarian. Yay, Rotary. And after this break, we're going to take another short break. I want to come back so that Pat can tell us a little bit more about the design of this memorial and how all of us can help to support it. So please join us after this break.
Hey, you.
Yeah, you. Getting that college education, what are you gonna do? Graduate and take some office job? Be like everybody else?
Or will you dare do something different?
Like, be a teacher. You could be my teacher. You got the skills.
The smarts?
Yes, you. You could be the teacher I never forget.
That would be cool.
Does that corporate job even have recess? What are you gonna make of yourself?
What are you gonna make of me?
Saving for retirement might be easy for some folk, but for others, it might take a little more work. And for those who haven't started, there are still things you can do to catch up.
Oh, that is good news.
Like getting out from underneath past debt. And don't get wrapped up with high-interest credit cards.
Get you some eyes.
Be diversified with your investments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Your financial goals are not out of reach. The choice is clear. For a happy ending, choose to save.
Everyone with alcohol and drug addiction is in the same boat. With treatment, you can find solid ground. For drug and alcohol information and treatment referral for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP.
Oh, look, a redhead.
Staring contest.
You still got it. I know.
Come alive with the forest.
The dad was cute.
You were looking right at us.
Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome back to the final segment of Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Joining me is Pat Wirth from the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association, and we are talking about the building of this memorial in Occaquan to commemorate the 72 years plus that over 9 million women worked so hard to get women the right to vote. And you were talking before the break about the design.
Right. The rendering I have up right now is of the rotunda that's going to be a focal point on the plaza. And if you look closely, what you'll see is a suffragist in the middle in front of jailhouse gates with her hands clasped above her head. And that's actually Lucy Burns. That actually happened to her on the night of terror because she was trying to find out how everyone was doing when they were all beaten that evening. And so she was trying to do a roll call, and they tied her up. It's pretty horrific. But as I said, every element of the design, there's a reason for it.
You know, and that's another thing that we need to remind ourselves of what Americans have done to other Americans in the name of maintaining the status quo. This infliction of this brutality, holding women without charges, without a hearing, this was what the government did to American citizens. And people need to embrace the fact that that is how we got to 2017, is on the backs of people who are willing to do that.
One of the things I will say that that also people aren't aware of is until the 19th Amendment was ratified, that was when women first entered the Constitution and became citizens. They weren't considered citizens until the amendment was passed. They were never mentioned in the Constitution until that time. That was the first time.
Amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
Something to remember here as we're celebrating the 4th of July is the fact that women were not in our Constitution until 1920. Okay, yeah. People remember that.
Yeah, exactly. So to accomplish our mission, number one, we're building the memorial. And once the memorial is built, we want to establish a Turning Point Institute. And we want to provide programs in leadership and advocacy for young girls from all over the country. We are in the process right now of developing a national board of advisors that are helping us out in all the states, because this is a national memorial. And they will be helping find young women to bring here for us to be able to do these programs. But we really want to explain how important advocacy is. I think I heard you say earlier on a different segment at one point that if people don't get together and do things with intentionality, it doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. You have to absolutely say, when we talk about getting more women elected to office, that's not happening like by itself.
Exactly.
You have to decide to make it happen.
So these are some of the organizations that have already stepped up that are partners that will be partners in our Turning Point Institute for our girls. We've got Delta Sigma Theta, George Mason University, Gunston Hall, League of Women Voters, Montpelier, National Association of Women Business Owners, Nova Parks, and the Workhouse Arts Center. And there are others that we're talking with, but I don't have formal arrangements with them yet. But they're at the ready. They get this thing built, they're ready. Once we get this built, green, go. We're going to go with this.
There's plenty of opportunity for other partners.
Exactly.
Right? Because this is a memorial to the entire movement for women across the United States. So yes, it is located in Northern Virginia, but people outside Northern Virginia need to care about getting this built.
Yes, they do. So one of the questions we've had is, why aren't you building this in Washington, D.C.?
Right.
And it's like, well, first of all, they're on the mall. First of all, they're not going to put anything on the mall. They've run out of room, and I think Congress has made a decision not to do that. Second of all, the history took place in Occaquan. The memorial will be built on the historic prison grounds that became the turning point in forcing President Wilson to go to Congress and do something.
Right.
And so it's being built there. So we thought about, well, how can we pry people out of Washington to get down where we are? And so we have developed with partners a Constitution Trail.
Oh.
It will start at the National Archives.
What a great idea.
And it will go to Mount Vernon. Washington, of course, was the president of the Constitutional Convention. Get on a boat and go on down to Gunston Hall. George Mason wrote the Bill of Rights. Now, he didn't write the Bill of Rights for the Constitution. We know that. He did it for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and then other states adopted it. And in fact, Mason was one of 3 delegates to the Constitutional Convention that didn't sign the Constitution because it didn't have the Bill of Rights. And then James Madison they added it maybe 12 years later or something like that. And then you get on a bus, or then you come down the Potomac River, up the Occaquan River to our memorial, and we will represent the 19th Amendment. Then we'll take you on a bus and we'll go to Montpelier. And all things Constitution there with James Madison.
That's a great idea, the Constitution. I love this idea of the Constitution Trail.
There is no Constitution Trail in this country. And there's a trail for everything, but not this. And so we just found this to be an ideal way where we could sandwich ourselves in with these well-known historical properties, but all related by the Constitution.
That's a great
various
idea.
Things about the Constitution.
Great idea.
So that's what we're going to do. So the next question everybody asks us is, how much is this going to cost? Well, it's going to cost $2 million to build out the entire memorial. $2 million in terms of memorials is not a lot of money. I don't happen to have it in my checkbook, so it's a lot of money to me. But in terms of memorials, it's not a lot of money. So that's what we need to have this money in the next 20 months, which is February of 2019, because that gives us 18 months to get it built in time to dedicate it for the 100th anniversary. Yeah.
So let me just make a comparison here about the $2 million. $2 million, which a lot of people are like, wow, $2 million, it seems like a lot of money. In 2015, we spent $45 million in the elections in 2015 to have every single incumbent reelected to office. Nothing changed. All incumbents were reelected, but Virginians and organizations and money from outside Virginia, $45 million was wasted in 2015. So I just want people to understand, when you talk in terms of millions of dollars, there's millions of dollars that are coming out of people's pockets. What you have to ask yourself is, where do you want to invest your millions of dollars?
Yeah.
And people need to be looking at putting money in building a monument to the journey of women to get the vote.
I agree, because once the women, one of the reasons that the women really put the hardcore press on at the beginning of the 20th century is because during the Progressive Era, they got very involved with, they formed the Greater Federation of Women's Clubs. The PTA was formed. There were a lot of labor unions for women became effective. But the women could only go so far with their organizations without being able to have legislation that was affected that would further their causes. And so they realized that they could go just so far without the vote. And that's why, when they crossed that threshold into the 20th century, it was like, we have really got to get the vote now. And that was one of the reasons why they did this. So we've accomplished a lot. We've had over $500,000 of in-kind donations. Nova Parks is providing the land. We don't have to buy the land. They're providing perpetual maintenance for us. We've had over 30,000 hours in volunteer time. We have nationally renowned historians that are working with us. We have an honorary board. We have our national board. And we have full support of Fairfax County, but we know what that budget's like. So if there's any money coming from Fairfax County, it's
got to look somewhere else.
Got to look somewhere else. And so I'd also like to name who some of our national strategic partners are that we've been working with that have endorsed our project. We have AAUW. We have the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, the Greater Federation of Women's Clubs, and the women's clubs back in the day were very instrumental.
Yes, they were.
You know, there were over 1 million, maybe there were 2 million club women, and the majority of them were very in favor of suffrage. And the organization itself came out in favor of the federal amendment in 1914. So they were involved. NABO, the National Women's History Project, Nova Parks. So we have some really great strategic partners that we're working with. And here's some of the challenges we have. Time is not on my side, Catherine.
20 months, no.
Time is not on my side. I will follow any lead. I'm looking for corporations, for foundations, for individuals with capacity to provide money. I'll go anywhere, talk to anybody, explain what we're trying to do. Our memorial has naming rights. So for people that are interested in having their name on a national memorial to commemorate 5 million women and everything that they did, we've got the ability to do that. And one of the things that we have found is that when you're looking at all philanthropic donations in a given year, less than 7% goes to women-centric projects.
Yes, we were talking a little bit about that, and I had said that Julie Jakobic had said at the Women's Summit in last week in Leesburg that of all the political contributions made to candidates, only 10% are made by women.
Well, and here's a Smithsonian Institute statistic for you. When you look at all of the memorials in the United States, less than 8% are to women.
Right. I mean, like this is
we're talking 5 million women here, folks. So
right.
Yeah.
This is really out of whack. Like in a major way,
exactly.
Women are not represented.
So, the things that we're looking for are we're looking for major gifts. We're looking for in-kind donations. So if you have a construction company and you want to build this for me, that would be fine. That would be good. I'd be happy to have you work with our architect on that. Introductions to people that don't know about our project, don't know the history. People don't know the history.
Which is the whole point of having done the show.
Yeah, and we're looking for more national strategic partners, and we're, anybody that can help us with public relations and to get things, get the information out there about us and what we're trying to do. So that's what would be extremely helpful.
And I'm on board with you. And so that's what I'm going to ask our viewers to do, is to think about what organizations they are already involved in. And because there's a lot of fundraising that's done here locally in Northern Virginia, we really need to broaden the scope of organizations or corporations that are more national in scope, that have greater capacity to be able to donate the funds necessary. And as Pat has said, 20 months, the clock is ticking, folks, 20 months in order to raise the rest of this $2 million needed to build this memorial. And it's an honor that Virginia should have it in the location where so much suffering took place by women so that the rest of us could have the right to vote. And looking at Independence Day, here in Northern Virginia, I think it's incumbent on us when we think about the great democratic experiment, which is our government in the United States, that we give some visibility, credibility, and this memorial to our country to acknowledge the fact that millions, 5 million women did the hard work to get women the right to vote. Thank you so much, Pat, for being here and sharing this with us.
Thank you.